much. Now we move on to Middle East. Israeli Army Chief Eyal Zamir has announced that several senior Israeli army commanders who served before and during the October 7, 2023 Hamas attack will be dismissed from reserve service. Zamir has said that he has fired and also reprimanded several senior commanders over the military's failure to protect the civilians of the State of Israel. The announcement marks one of the most far-reaching accountability actions in IDF's history. It follows what Zamir described as a thorough, professional, and in-depth inquiry into the systematic breakdowns that allowed the devastating assault. The October 7, 2023 attack was carried out by Hamas and other Gaza-based militants and saw coordinated infiltrations by land, air, and sea. Over 1,200 Israelis were killed, most of them being civilians, and approximately 240 hostages were abducted into Gaza. Now for this discussion, we welcome Mr. Sorel Sadka. He's a political commentator, joins us live from Tel Aviv. Now, Sol, do you think this accountability is legitimate and logical for Israel to do, as we know that this is the biggest such action in IDF's history? Sol, you might be muted here.
Hi.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yes, it certainly was legitimate. It was the biggest action of its type in Israel's history, firing and dismissing and removing from reserve so many generals. However, it was by far the biggest failure in the history of the military. And although the war since has turned out in Israel's favor, nevertheless, the failures on that day that took 6-7 hours to get under control, when a country with a huge military budget managed by these generals was unable to retard or prevent the ingress of 3,000 or 4,000 mostly lightly armed terrorists, is astonishing and will need to be investigated for decades to come. The lessons that will be learned from it are almost endless, but removing the generals that were sitting at the top of the IDF at the time seems to be absolutely critical. Whatever they did wrong might not be known yet, but certainly the mentality, the general complacency, their understanding of the field situation, of the strategic situation, and of the malevolent intent of their enemies, their underestimation of that intent is what led to the disaster. It should never have been allowed to happen.
So how do you...
You're absolutely correct. These people should be fired. And in my opinion, there are one or two of them whose incompetence was so great that it reaches the level of criminal negligence, and they should be charged and jailed.
So you're saying that some officers were too relaxed or they weren't attentive towards these?
Absolutely. And we even have information that they published themselves from the IDF spokesman's office in the weeks before, where a number of generals went on a tour of the Gaza border and reassured civilians in the area and also via social media to the entire country that there was nothing to worry about, that Hamas had no intention of attacking Israel. And it would have been one thing if they just told that to the people to calm them down, but it seems quite clear that they absolutely believed that themselves. This was their perspective that they were working on. This is why there were only a few hundred troops in the border area facing what they knew was an army of 35,000 armed men. The level of incompetence and complacency is staggering, absolutely staggering. And the lower you go down the chain of command, to some extent, up to a point. So the people who, for example, were in charge of the Gaza division and the people who were running the Southern Command, who were directly responsible, well, their level of responsibility, in my opinion, is even higher because they really only had one job. Their job was to sit there facing the Gaza border, noticing there are 35,000 enemies on the other side trying to get in, and ensure that they couldn't. And as you go up higher the chain of command, the distance from the responsibility is slightly further, but at the same time, the buck stops there. So all that entire chain of command, from the local field divisions on the southern border, all the way up to the top of the army at the time, and the intelligence services and the military intelligence, all of them really have to go. And some of them, in my opinion, need to go to jail.
Right, and so why do you think these people who exactly like you mentioned that they only have one job to do, especially being in the border, staying alert? Why do you think they underestimated these?
It seems to me, from speaking to people who met all these people, that the kind of man, because it is almost all men, who would stay in the army after their compulsory service and take a career in the army for decades, were not necessarily the best soldiers, the most strategic thinkers, or even the brightest people. They were the people who, for whatever reason, thought this would be a useful career with the opportunity of a very early pension at perhaps 45, at which point they can go into business. This was essentially their plan. And from the other direction, how these people were selected, it was also clear that it was an old boys club, that the people who were allowed to rise to the top of the IDF and intelligence services were not necessarily even the brightest of those careerists, who themselves were not the brightest. They were picked because of their family connections, their historical, almost clan connections within Israeli culture, because of political views that were felt to be congenial to the established culture at the top of the IDF. So it was always replacing itself with a kind of groupthink.
Right.
And that groupthink, essentially, more than anything,
Right.
except perhaps the Hamas's own actions, of course, is really what led to the calamity. Because even faced with mounting evidence that Hamas were absolutely planning to do what they did, I mean, Hamas even built a mock-up Israeli village about 3 kilometers from the Israeli border. And the Israeli low-level soldiers are watching Hamas train there, doing kidnapping and murder operations in this mock-up Israeli village. They passed the information up to the chain of command, and yet nothing was done. The levels of incompetence and groupthink are astonishing, and it can only be due to, on the one hand, careerists who were not the best, and them themselves being picked by people right at the top, who themselves, of course, are also careerists from a generation before, who are picking people out of that pool of careerists due to their personal affiliations rather than their competence.
Yes.
And as a result, we have what we have, and all these people have to go.
Yes. I hope that will be changed, but thank you very much, Sol, for joining us today and sharing that insight as a political commentator from Tel Aviv. Now we move on to Asia. Hong Kong leader John Lee has said that his government fully backs China's diplomatic